Have you ever stopped to consider that sometimes the greatest pain comes from the people we love the most? It's not the stranger on the street or your coworker. It's the one you hugged, fed, raised, and protected. Now imagine giving the house where you lived most of your life to your own child, with the promise that when they grew up, they'd have a guaranteed room. And years later, discovering they want to charge you rent. It sounds like a soap opera script, right? But this story is true and shows how a simple gesture of love can spark a legal battle by one emotional betrayal and a generational clash. Here we go beyond the scandal. We'll understand what leads a mother to be treated like a burden. And even more, how she turned this situation around with courage, strategy, and emotional memory. In this video, you will see that not everything written is stronger than a promise. That unsigned contract, in fact, it can have weight. When there is evidence, clear intentions, and maternal sacrifice, you'll see how the silence can be broken with a simple recording and how documents left in a warehouse can become weapons of justice. This is a story about love, power, greed, and about the woman who refused to disappear from her own story. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home or silenced by those who were supposed to protect you, this is for you. And when you finish it, you might also discover that sometimes speaking up is the only way to survive. Giving someone a home isn't just about signing a deed. It's often about giving away a part of your soul, your story, your life. This mother, with a heart full of pride and hope, gave her home to her son, wedding gift, and along with the keys, he gave her something even more valuable, a verbal promise that, whenever she needed, she could live there. No pressure or humiliation. Just the basics: acceptance, trust, love. For years, that promise was enough. She believed the eyes that looked at her with emotion upon receiving that gift would never deny their agreement. After all, who needs a contract between mother and son? Between those who truly love each other, a word is enough, right? With that thought, she lived in peace until the envelope arrived. That morning, between a cup of coffee and a slice of bread, he heard the subtle sound of a piece of paper sliding through the door. He thought it was a supermarket advertisement. It was, in fact, the beginning of an earthquake, a warning of rent collection issued by his own son, $200 a month, with an expiration date. And then there was a clause stipulating that he would lose his guest privileges if he didn't pay on time. The impact wasn't just economic, it was moral, psychological, human. After all, how could someone who grew up in that house, who played in the backyard and fell asleep on their mother's lap, now refer to her as a tenant? The newspaper didn't even mention the word mother. It was as if I had become a name on a bill, a number on a spreadsheet. And what started as a gift turned into a family conflict, one of those that are not cured with excuses. This episode, as absurd as it may seem, isn't so unusual. How many stories have you heard of unsettled inheritances, of parents who trust too much, of children who forget their promises? Donation of property, if it's not accompanied by clarity and protection, it can become the first step toward emotional tragedy. And here, it was just the beginning. The pain of betrayal doesn't arise from the act itself, but from the contrast between what was promised and what was delivered. For that mother, what hurt wasn't just the amount of the debt. It was the cold look on her son's face. It was the profound silence of her daughter-in-law. Growing, it was the realization that that house, once filled with laughter and coffee in the late afternoon, was now just another piece of property to explore, an asset, a number on the couple's spreadsheet. They wanted more than the rent. They wanted complete freedom over the property. And their plan was clear: kick her out. They didn't ask her to leave. They pushed her out with kind words and calculated gestures. She discovered they were preparing the space for Airbnb, decorating the rooms with new pillows and price tags, as if it were the last hurdle before monetization. It was the finally winning phase, as Kyla exclaimed on move-in day. But winning, in this case, meant erasing history, rewriting the home, removing the matriarch from the equation. And she saw it in the details: the closed pantry, the uninvited dinners, the new treatment, from mother to Margaret. Thus begins the story: emotional abuse in families, not with shouting but with subtle distance. and suddenly, home becomes hostile territory. Many people live this in silence, out of shame, out of fear of being labeled dramatic, or because they still harbor hope that everything will get better. But the truth is, financial manipulation, it begins when someone stops being a person and becomes an expense. And that's precisely what this mother became in her son's mind. An expense. A nuisance. It's hard to admit, but mother-son relationship, it can also be toxic. When there is no gratitude, no empathy, no memory, what remains is the coldness of those who believe everything has a price. But this story would show that some promises, even forgotten by those who made them, live on in those who received them. The night she quietly left home, she took with her more than just a backpack. She took with her the pain of no longer being seen as part of that home. She spent hours in a pharmacy parking lot, reflecting, until she decided to rummage through the trunk. And there, among old folders and forgotten memories, she found a box. Inside, a hope, old documents, notes, and something even more valuable. A draft contract. The handwriting was from her late husband. It was written in bold letters that the house had been given to Daniel on the condition that he could live there for the rest of his life, unless he left of his own free will. It was simple, direct, and full of feeling. It wasn't a formal contract, but it had a date, a signature, and most importantly, intent. It was an anchor in the chaos. Many people underestimate the value of old documents. They think they're trash, useless. But when the world turns its back on them, what remains is what can be proven. Documentary evidence, even though it was simple, it changed everything. It showed that donation of property, it was not unconditional. It was loaded with meaning and moral clauses that had to be respected. What moved her most was the attached note. Keep this for your records. You might need it in the future. It was as if her husband, though absent, had left her a shield to protect her. And in that moment, she knew she wasn't alone, that this struggle, though difficult, had a reason to exist, and that now there was something concrete to share. It was there, sitting among dusty papers and stifled tears, that she realized her story didn't end with a rental letter. That's where the turning point began. Strength, justice. And that's why you should never underestimate a note written with love. Because sometimes it's what saves a life. When he quietly returned home one day when he knew his son wouldn't be home, he found Kyla alone, taking photos of the decorations. What was supposed to be just a conversation turned into a confession. Kyla, unaware she was being recorded, spilled the beans. The idea was actually to put the house in Airbnb, that the furniture in her room had already been removed, and that they expected her to leave without any drama. What seemed like paranoia turned into proof. Clear proof that there had been premeditated intention. Recording this conversation wasn't an act of malice. It was an act of survival. How often are women believed when they say they've been betrayed, cheated on, or manipulated? Recording was the only way to prove it wasn't an emotional exaggeration, but undue influence. It was a strategy. It was the stark, naked truth, spoken by the one who orchestrated it all behind that friendly smile. And it wasn't enough to just record it. She forwarded the audio to herself, saved it to several cloud services, and sent it to her lawyer. She knew that in cases like this, evidence could disappear and cell phones could be accidentally lost. This woman, who had been treated as fragile for so long, demonstrated a practical intelligence that few would expect from someone in her position. And that was decisive. The recording also revealed something even sadder. Contempt. The way Kyla spoke of her, as if she were a troublesome tenant, was just the tip of the iceberg. Emotional abuse. She lived in silence. It wasn't enough to get her out of the house. It had to be made to seem fair, normal, as if the entire world could be guided by Excel spreadsheets, not by bonds of love and promises. But not just any audio recording will do in court. The lawyer was clear. Recording without advance notice is risky in some states. But in her case, at her home, in the tone of a casual conversation and without invading privacy, the evidence was valid. And what's more, compelling. It was the piece that connected everything, from the initial promise to the eviction attempt. A click that changed the story. For many, entering a courtroom is like entering enemy territory. But for her, it was the only way. backpack in hand, documents organized, and audio saved on her cell phone. She sat facing a world that had always seemed distant. Judicial mediator, she watched, the lawyer at her side whispering instructions, and across the table were Daniel and Kyla, elegant, calm, their minds rehearsed. To them, it was just another meeting. To her, it was a matter of life or death. When Daniel offered her $30,000 to leave the house and end the dispute, she was furious, not because of the amount, but because of the implication that all of this could be bought. "That's more than generous," she said, as if the house had sprung up out of nowhere, as if it hadn't been built with her husband's sweat equity, supported by the estate's money, donated with faith in her own son. That wasn't an offer. It was an insult disguised as an agreement. Michael, the lawyer, remained calm. He refuted every argument, and when he showed the Airbnb listing with recent photos of the house, the entire courtroom understood. They didn't want peace, but profit. What had seemed like a domestic dispute was now turning into a financial manipulation, and this seriously affected the trial. Daniel's credibility began to crumble. The masks faded, especially when Kyla was called to testify. Under oath, she tried to hide it, but the pressure was too much. And then, the ruling that changed everything. We didn't think he'd react. It was at that moment that even the judge, even the lawyers, felt the blow. Because that ruling wasn't just about an eviction, it was about dehumanization. It was about turning a mother into an obstacle, a presence into an expense, a love into a problem. And the trial took another turn. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about intergenerational conflict, about broken promises, about what it means to have a home. The judge didn't issue a sentence there, but she made it clear. There was a breach of trust, a grave moral violation. And for the first time since the rent notice, she left the courtroom with her head held high, not with victory in her pocket, but with dignity in her chest. Halfway through the proceedings, a letter from the court arrived like a punch in the gut. They asked for identification, birth certificates, and adoption information. What she had buried beneath love, affection, and coexistence resurfaced like a legal ghost. Daniel wasn't her biological son. She had adopted as a child he never knew. He was never treated differently. But now, that fact was a key factor. She cried, yes. She cried because she had to revive papers she no longer remembered where they were, because she saw that something pure could be used against her. But the lawyer firmly pointed out, "This proves how much you loved him. You chose him. And that's worth more than any DNA." That reassured her. Because, in fact, what she gave wasn't just a roof, but a name, a home, a legacy. Sorting through the paperwork brought back memories, old photos, birthdays, and school reports she'd carefully saved. She found a note from James, her late husband, written on the day of the adoption. "Love is more than genetics. Meg is now her mother. This is just to formalize it." And that became a point in the lawsuit. It proved she'd built that family with dedication, without any obligation. Maternal sacrifice, legitimate. Of course, there was a risk. The defense tried to use the adoption as an argument that she had no right to the house because she wasn't a blood relative. But there, once again, narrative prevailed over formalism. The judge understood. She was a mother in every sense of the word. She raised him, cared for him, protected him. And more than that, she gave Daniel a life he might never have had. All of this without asking for anything in return, until she was betrayed. This revelation redefined the case. It showed that the bond wasn't just one of affection, but of choice. And that the pain of betrayal wasn't just legal, but existential. It was the world crumbling because of a child she had embraced, taught to walk, and who now wanted to erase her from history. But now, this story was hers too, and she was willing to tell it until the end. With every step she took into the room, she recovered something that seemed lost, her narrative, because until then she was just another crying old woman. But with the documents in her hand, recordings saved, old tickets, and history adoption, now she was a person with a purpose. The judge, hearing the draft James had left and the note with the phrase, "Save for the future," shook her head. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a testament of love. The judge emphasized, even without signed contract, the promise was firm. There was a clear line of intent, trust, and coexistence that had to be respected. Furthermore, the woman's efforts to preserve records, memories, and details of family life were unusual. It was proof of her constant commitment, unlike those who treated her like a tenant. When the judge said she would make her decision within 72 hours, something changed inside her. For the first time since her eviction, she returned home, or rather, to the small apartment where she had been sheltering, with the feeling that the storm was beginning to subside. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a relief. It was justice in action. It was dignity returning to the victim. In the days that followed, she relived her memories like someone opening windows after a heavy rain. She remembered James watering the plants, Daniel learning to ride a bike, the cold nights when he slept on the couch alone so as not to disturb anyone. It was a rich history, full of moments no rent could afford. The house wasn't just hers, it was hers. And although the result didn't guarantee her return to the residence, she knew one thing: the legacy. She was saved. The court no longer saw her as a woman in litigation, but as a woman fighting for her memory, her promise, her voice. And for that alone, her story was victorious. Because in the end, the greatest right she won was not to be forgotten. How many times have you given up on your own just to keep the peace? How many promises have you silently swallowed just to avoid conflict? This story is a mirror, and if you saw a part of yourself in it, don't ignore that reflection. What begins with a gesture of love, like donation of a property, it can become a battlefield. But that doesn't mean you should accept being erased from your own history. What this woman teaches us is powerful. Even with age, with pain, with tears, she rose. She sought documentary evidence, she redeemed tickets, faced trials, and above all, trusted her own voice. That's courage, that's dignity. And if she could do it, you can too. You can protect what you've built. You can break with the idea that it's ugly to fight for your family, because even uglier is letting disrespect become routine. So now I ask you, what do you still need to protect? What memory do you need to record? What promise needs to be witnessed? It's never too late to react. It's never too little when it comes to your home, your voice, your story. And if you enjoyed this journey, if you learned something from it, if you were moved in any way, be part of our community. Subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications. Here, we transform stories into strength and wounds into paths back home.